Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly. I'm from Atlassian. Welcome to our first live stream. So today we are officially kicking off a new series. You might ask yourself why we're doing this, and the short answer is for you. We wanted to create a series where we discuss a wide range of topics around Agile and DevOps and bring along industry experts and then people like you. I want to bring you along in the conversation. So yeah, I'm really excited for y'all to be here today. I'm going to give everyone a couple more seconds to get in, and I will introduce myself, introduce our guest, give you a little landscape of what we're going to talk about today, and then we'll get right into it. So my name is Kelly Drozd. I'm a product marketer at Atlassian, but actually I have a pretty diverse background. I have a marketing operations background. I did IT staffing and services, sales and fundraising. But before starting at Atlassian, I led Agile adoption and transformation efforts across marketing teams at one of the world's largest nonprofits. Anyone that has transformation or is responsible for Agile and change management understands how large of a task that was. So it was a really great experience, and I'm super happy to be here at Atlassian. A little bit more about me. So I love complex situations and environments. I'm a bit of a dreamer that likes getting energized by the vision of what could happen. I strongly dislike the status quo, and waste drives me crazy. And because of all of these things, I have really become an avid learner and an Agile enthusiast. I'm a podcast listener. I'm always juggling audiobooks and reading a variety of things at the same time. So chatting with someone like John Cutler today is really, really exciting, and it's an absolute honor. So let's say hello to John. For those of you that do not know John, which I know a lot of people do, so John's background is in product management, product team coaching, UX research. He's currently the head of product research and education at Amplitude. Prior to Amplitude, John worked at companies like AppFolio, Zendesk, Pendo, AdKeeper, RichFX, and he's even a startup founder. So John, if you don't know him again, John passionately writes and tweets a lot about product, and he can be heard teaching and coaching around the world, which is awesome. So we're so happy to have him here today. So I would really love to say that we're going to be able to unpack all things product today, but we're really going to try to stay focused on what John calls the art of thinking big and working small. So John, before we start, for those that are tuning in that might not be familiar with you, can you share a little bit about product intelligence and the work that you and your team does at Amplitude?
Sure. Yep. First, super excited to try out this format with you. This is exciting to be able to chat with you as well. I know you were kind of working the cameras and sort of like involved in the previous session we tried, and so to be able to chat one-on-one with you is really an honor. Yeah, so as Kelly mentioned, I work at a company called Amplitude. Amplitude focuses on helping product teams be more impactful by using data analytics. So we actually call it product intelligence because it's not just analytics, it's also how you take action with that data. So it's an interesting space to be in. You know, my background, I would say, is sort of a product nerd. So my job is really great in the sense that I just get to interact with tons of teams all around the world. So doing coaching sessions and writing and working with teams. Now, I'm actually growing my own team now, which is exciting. So ideally, I'm going to let the sort of superstars on my team do a lot of that while I try to create a nice environment for them. But that's sort of my role. So we at Amplitude, we think of education as an extension of the product. It's kind of all the product. So we actually have a product manager on our team. We have learning experience designers. So we really try to take this holistic view of what we're doing. And yeah, hopefully that's enough background. I think the luckiest thing is Amplitude gets to work with like just some of Atlassian as a customer. We get to work with just some of the best product teams in the world, and then also teams that are sort of aspiring and in some form of kind of transformation or some transition. So it's like getting a snapshot of 20 years of product teams, every week, which is exciting.
That's awesome. Great. Well, thank you for sharing. So I am going to give kind of a brief landscape of the world for people that are listening in that have Agile experience and worked in software development for 20, 30, 40 years. None of this is a surprise, but for those people that might not be extremely familiar, so I'm going to use something that John wrote recently to kick us off. So John said in an article that teams end up leaving their waterfalls and whirlpools to iterate nowhere in particular, no real strategy, no holistic end-to-end thinking. For them, it's a random walk punctuated by stand-ups and sprints. So I love that, John. Like when I was obviously reading a lot of your stuff like I usually do, and I saw that and I was like, copy paste. I need to remember this. This is really great. So it's 2021. John, you reminded me this yesterday that we're more like 40 years since
Us, yeah.
its way into software development, but this is the 20th year since the Agile Manifesto was introduced, right? So, over those 40 years, teams started slowly moving away, sometimes very slowly, away from this waterfall type approach, and started moving away from projects and becoming more product organization, adopting more agile ways of working. I'm using air quotes. So very generally speaking, organizations and teams went from these big bang, big launch approaches to finding ways to continuously deliver in more iterative, small segments of work. So while the agile values and principles really changed the way that teams work and they really solve problems for customers, the mileage seemed to vary from what people are really getting out of Agile. I'm sure, you just said you have 20 years packed in, your experience with all the teams you see. So I'm sure you feel this. I know you write a lot about best practices and anti-practices, but today we do see a lot of product-led organizations that have really put product at the center of their organization, and there's companies that have not. They either just don't, or they go through the motions of Agile without really seeing the impact or desired results from organizations that are more Agile and more product-led. So that's a little bit of background. So John, we're going to start to unpack thinking big and working small. So I know you have a great little sketch about this that breaks down the different types of work, so to speak. I think Ashley's shown that. Awesome. So the first one is working big, which you said takes forever. So can you just define what does working big mean? Like, how does this actually manifest in the real world?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is to try to just get to the pure feelings and emotions that you have when you're kind of working on these particular efforts, right? And so, when you're working big, things just go at a glacial pace, and a lot of good things take time, actually. So it's not really about time as much as a sense of progress, right? And so I think we've all been in those situations where it just feels like a death march, right? It just feels like we're off in our own universes without any opportunities to kind of integrate our knowledge or integrate our progress or figure out whether we're working on the right thing or just reality checking about where we are. So that's kind of how I would describe working big, is in terms of the sensation, right? It just feels like this incredible batch, no sense of progress, incredibly large batch, and no sense of progress, no sense of learning, no sense of reducing risk or reducing uncertainty as long as you're working. And it just feels, it feels like you're not going anywhere. And so interestingly, I think this is all very relative, and this is what people don't take into account. I was joking with someone the other day and they said, oh my God, I'm worried about this project being a waterfall project. And I said, well, talk to me about it. They're like, I don't know, it's going to take 4 weeks. It's just this waterfall. Like, if you haven't been in an environment where you've covered a 70-foot wall with 70 printouts of a Microsoft project thing with massive dependencies of those things, it's almost like everyone talks about waterfall, but no one's really done waterfall. Like, maybe waterfall didn't even exist as people normally think that it existed, right? But it's it's funny how relative it is. So it's really contextual in your environment. So maybe for that person in their environment, 4 weeks sort of felt like that sense of like, they had exchanged their waterfalls for a whirlpool. They just felt like they're going nowhere. Meanwhile, there's a lot of really impactful work that is going to take quarters and years. And in those environments, you have contextually a sense of progress, or you have a sense of no progress. So hopefully that I'm just trying to tie it to the emotions without talking about like time as an absolute in these things. It's more of a sensation, if that makes sense.
Is it something that you can see from an outsider's perspective? Like, are there signs or symptoms that a company or team is working too big, where if you were to say something or give an example, someone would be like, oh man, this is my team. This is something that I should identify and start maybe approaching our work a little bit differently?
Oh, I mean, you can tell very quickly just by asking questions. You'll say like, what have you learned about your customers lately? So, not much. Or you'll say, when was the last time you celebrated as a team? And this is what I'm talking about. There's an emotion to it too. Like, when was the last time you celebrated as a team? I don't know, like, about 3 months ago, we finally got the one thing into production, but we're sort of waiting on this other team. And, so celebration, this sense of how much you're learning. But I always use this word integration. And I think people from an engineering background commonly think of integration like you're integrating code, you're maybe putting it in an environment, you're taking the threads or the branches or whatever, and you're combining them into something that's integrated end to end. And I actually extend the idea of integration to our understanding of the customer, to celebration, to many other things as well. Like, if you and I are solving a problem, we each go out for 3 days, we integrate our understanding of the problem 3 days later. And then we understand kind of what we're doing with that. And so what you're really looking for in these the sort of working big environment is a lack of integration across many different types of integration of knowledge, integration of technology, integrating with the market. Mm-hmm. They'll say things. The funny thing about those environments is they're in a perpetual death spiral. They're so far behind the market that by the time they finally get the thing out there, they've already thought about the next thing that they need to build. So it's these times of cycles you're talking about with working big. I think everyone watching can relate and understand. It's a little tough to put it into words, but hopefully I'm doing okay.
Yeah. Cool. I like what you said about the question you could ask your team, when's the last time you got feedback from your customer? I think that's a great example of working big. And to your example, if you're working on something for weeks, days, months, years, how are you getting feedback on? Like, how are you getting feedback on it? And if you're not, like you said, did the market change? Did my customers change? Like a million things could have changed. So I think that's a really great example that you bring up.
Just does it feel sludgy?
or just if it feels sludgy, that's also great.
Yeah, does it feel sludgy? That's a good thing.
Cool. So we are going great. I'm glad that people can relate to that. Thank you. So we're going to leave a couple minutes. We're going to do some Q&A in between. So are there any questions for John on the idea of working big, what that looks like, that sludgy feeling, any examples before we move on? Awesome. John, I have a question. Are there any, yeah, that's great. Are there any upsides to working big?
Well, I think we'll get to that, right?
Okay.
I mean, I think that this is the thing that, I mean, one could ask, like, why do we intuitively work big? And frankly, I relate this to our own lives as well. Like, I always think it's hypocritical when the person comes in for the Agile whatever, blank, 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 and then you ask them how they conduct their own life. And they're like, oh, I've been working on that book for 18 months. And like, I've been meaning to get in shape. And, I'm thinking about going back to school, or I want to write that screenplay, but I never write it. So like all these things are kind of counterintuitive to a sense, right? So the working big has definite advantages in some environments, right? If the only way you can get anything done is to pitch a huge project internally in your company, and that's the only way you can get the CFO to pay attention, or whoever's doing budgeting, and that's the only way you can get that effort blessed, then you're going to intuitively, there are many, many, many incentives in a corporate environment to work big. And that's one of the things. So you mentioned the advantages. I think that the advantages are sort of first order, second order, and third order advantages. If you're in a corporate environment, there's first order advantages to thinking big. You will get a budget, you will get people to pay attention. And the funny thing is that no one really cares. Like by the time you ship the big thing, someone else has another big idea. And no product manager gets fired because they shipped the big thing. They're like, well, that person executed. Now on to the next big thing. So there's many, many incentives to working big. I also think what's important for people is that the meaningful problems we need to solve around the environment and healthcare and even related to the pandemic are big problems. And that we'll get onto that with thinking big. But like the people whose environments they don't allow themselves to think big kind of gets the problems we'll discuss later. So I don't know, there's a bit of a trade-off.
Okay, cool. So on to the next. So the next is work small.
Yep.
So talk about working big. Let's talk about working small. Define working small. How does this look in the real world?
Yeah, so this is the sort of like agile Scrum hamster wheel, as I put it. That like, hey, how are you doing? Oh, we're a super high performing agile shop. I mean, we're like, there's points. It's all about the points. That burn down is just going like crazy. Everyone is super reliable and everyone's accountable, and the team meets their commitments. Oh my goodness. We ship every week. Ship is actually, we'll discuss that word. Like we put things into production every single week. And so that's working small, right? So like working small. Now here's the thing about working small. Every one of these has sort of an advantages and a twist to it. If you have never worked small, working small is actually a huge muscle to build. Yeah. Like I worked in an environment we went to 1-day sprints. So Ron Jeffries has this joke that if 2-week sprints are hard, you don't go to 4-week sprints, you go to 1-day sprints, right? And so, and here's an irony. I think there's a book called Shape Up by the Basecamp people, whatever, and they're like, oh, well, sprints suck or whatever. You should work in 6-week iterations, which is ironic because originally, like, there was like Scrum sprints, like Scrum time boxes of 6 weeks. So, when in doubt, bash Agile and then reinvent it, right? So the funny thing about it was that, like, but in that book, they're like, within 1 or 2 or 3 days of starting your 6-week thing, you have to put something in production and have something that we can hold. So the book wasn't saying don't work small. It was saying just, tackle something meaningful that has some meaning over a period of time to do it. So working small is an absolute skill. Like working in chunks that take you 1 hour, 2 hours, and 3 hours, or 1 or 2 or 3 days versus 1 or 2, 3 weeks or anything like that is a skill. The challenge, what I tried to do with that diagram is to say that, like, yeah, okay, it's a skill. But then you see a lot of environments that have just hyper optimized for that skill and haven't taken it kind of to the next level in terms of their thinking. And so that's how you'd know you were in that environment. Probably people would be pretty happy with what was happening. And certainly from a quality perspective, from engineering and other things, there'd probably be pretty high quality, right? In that sense that because you're integrating so frequently, if there were problems, you'd learn about it. Now, the questions about architecture and other things like that, notwithstanding, like that's where you would feel. So hopefully that gives people an impression of working small. I'm going to go back to the advantage, the example of our personal lives. Like working big is certainly, we all do that pretty well. Like I've got this big year-long effort to do it. Working small also relates to us individually, right? It's like, have you chipped away at something that you're doing? Are you like frequently doing something? So there's nothing inherently wrong with working small. It's just that if you stop there, maybe you're missing out.
Yeah, that reminds me of New Year's resolutions. I've actually stopped making them because for that very reason, making more things a little bit more manageable, right? Breaking them up a little bit, making them more specific. Awesome. So you talked a little bit about the benefits of working small. Are there, and I know you'll get to it, but you talked a little bit about potentially with working small or only working small.
Yeah.
Work can lack coherence. Things could feel a little scattershot. Are there any other things specifically that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this idea is it's all pretty fractal in this sense that like the original idea with small stories is that they should still meet these criteria of invest, and so invest is like independent, negotiable, and there's this idea of these little units of value. I think the thing that was missing in part of invest, which I'm sure people would agree with in some sense, is every solution or every problem is a nested solution to a higher level problem. Right. And so just because you have something that's independently valuable, you could say this is valuable for the purpose of integration, or this is valuable because a user can do a tiny thing that they could do that they couldn't do in the past, or, this is valuable because it's going to dictate the next 10 years of the company's life.
Yep.
Right. So valuable is very fractal in that particular sense. So I think that the symptoms that you see in those environments that are only working small is that you could probably see in those environments that even though there's a sense of momentum, if you were to retrospect after 6 months or 12 months and say like, what did we really move for the business?
Yeah.
What outcomes did we really have? People really wouldn't be able to identify them. They'd say, well, we got a lot of little things done, but we weren't really able to kind of move things in a meaningful way. That's probably the best symptom, that I think that the issue about cohesiveness is there's a tendency when it's very common in the sort of agile world to think about breaking things into small work, but the people are really good at this. Think about these, very, very thin slices across the problem space. And that's actually a really great example of working small and thinking big. Like if you go across a particular experience, right? Or if you go across the problem space, that's a really good sign of like an integrative type of thinking versus sort of cutting up things into little pieces like that. So hopefully that gives a good idea for folks.
Yeah. Cool. So I think there was a couple questions. Ashley, thank you for bringing that up. So is there a risk of too much analysis? Oh, this is great. As a result of each small iteration?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And I think that this also is about, so there's this idea of kind of batch costs or switching costs or batch things. And so one argument would be if you think about a particular or like retooling or costs. And so I don't know the exact word for it, but it's basically like one argument for working small against working small is that the transition costs between all these little small things creates a fair amount of overhead for the particular team. So you're kind of needing to get resituated. And there's actually like an optimal batch size that you should be working at. And that's how they think about it in manufacturing. It's like if the batch size is too big, you run into trouble. But if the batch size is too small, then setting up for each new batch is expensive. So I'm probably like butchering a lot of Kanban and like a lot of lean stuff. But I think that this question of analysis is, if a team has these extensive rituals around every single story, definition of done and sitting there and, like tasks and they have to have meetings for every little bit of work. Well, sure, analysis is going to be really expensive in proportion to every little small piece of work. But if you're able to lower the overhead of that particular like analysis or even integration, like if integrating a piece of code into the code base is really expensive and takes a long time, people are going to do it less often. And so this is this idea of like, you can tackle the problem one of two ways. You can make your batches big, which causes problems, or you can keep your batches small and address the symptoms and the overhead for getting each new batch into place like that. I've certainly known environments that by the time you added up all the meetings required to put like 15 tiny things into a sprint. I mean, people are they just want to go home. I mean, they didn't sign up for this to be sitting. I mean, no, I've spoken to Jira product managers, and it's like spending all day in Jira is not the metric I know that you all are looking for, because you use us for analytics and we've talked to your team. It's actually it's about collaboration and that type of stuff. So yeah, we don't want to see so much analysis in proportion to the size of the batch. So hopefully we could talk all day about batch size, but that's what comes to mind for that question.
Okay, cool. So there was a couple of questions on more of like the large view and then on SAFe specifically, but I'm going to hold those for now, and let's move on to the next, which is think big, work small. So define this for us, John.
Can you bring the picture back up again? Just so I'm remembering. I write this all at like 1 o'clock in the morning. Right on.
Wait, I skipped it. I'm sorry. Yeah. I was like, wait, this is the wrong. Yes. Thank you, Ashley. This is exactly why we have this. Define big, work small. I like how you, this is more slog in the internal burn down.
So this kind of has like some of the, people debated whether this was actually a step in these 4 things, but I think it really is, right? Because it's kind of like in define big, work small. Oh my God, that really makes your head explode, right? Because this is the thing that says you walk into the company and they say, well, we've got 500 things in the backlog. We've already sized them. We've already defined this massive big project and we're working in these tiny little pieces. So now you could argue, you could say, well, maybe it's just a big project. At least they're working small. At least they'll figure out if something isn't working.
Right.
But you have this, and actually I think this is related to the analysis question, oddly, right, that we just had, which is that like in this particular setting, the direction is not thinking. It's not about vision or anything like that. It's a highly prescriptive definition of what you're working on. And so I think I just threw that into the 4 to just respect that in some environments, this is the case where you walk into the company and they'll be like, well, we definitely take on big projects and we're doing Agile and whatever. And you're like, oh yeah, you kind of are. And then all these sort of like anti-patterns like slip out. It's kind of like, well, they've got, like I said, they've got the 500 stories in the backlog, or, they spend half their time analyzing these stories and going through all these sequential steps to figure it out. So does that make sense? Like it was a little bit of a stretch to fit it in the 3, but I thought I should put it in there just to remind people that exists.
Yeah, I have a question. Now that we've talked about the 3, right? Do you see in your experience that teams or organizations are just one of these 4 things? I guess we only talked about 3. One of these 3 things, or do they move kind of in between working small?
I mean, you'll have different parts of an organization working. You'll have different parts of the organization working in different ways, in fairness, to do these things. But I do think there's a little bit of a progression that I've noticed. I mean, here's one of the funniest things. I was at a conference and I met with one of the foremost XP mob programming, pair programming practitioners in the world. And he said, oh, I'm really curious about this product stuff. And I said, well, what do you mean? You don't have product management at your company? Oh, no. We are the highest performing feature factory in the world. He was joking, but he's not half wrong. Like in terms of like defects and quality and the practices, he's like, we are by all textbook definitions, the most agile shop in the world. But there's this whole other set of things that our company just doesn't think about yet. Yeah. Like we're really, really good at executing on these things. So I think that's worth mentioning, that like, maybe there is a bit of a progression here as people get into this. Product-led is definitely not product management-led. I just think it's a belief that design and technology can be this like force multiplier for sustainable growth for your company. I don't put it any other way than doing that. And it takes designers, it takes engineers, it takes sales, it takes the whole company to think that way. But I do see that there's a little bit of this. You could say that there's a little bit of a progression across these categories to do things. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that the first one is just complete chaos, and you could maybe even put that the third one's in second place, that they start defining things big and then working small, and then maybe they stop defining. It's like we don't need plans anymore because we're super agile, and then so I don't know. There is a bit of a progression, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned. I'll just say this, then I know we have some questions. You mentioned that you've seen or organizations sometimes kind of separate these types of people or teams where you have this whole teams that are thinking big, that are working big, and then you kind of have it split between the teams that are working small. But talk about, have you seen that in a way? And like, are there ways that an organization can repair that? And what do they do? Like, is it training? Is it bringing teams together? Like, how do you close that gap?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is just the natural evolution of these business environments. It's I always say that, if you're a bank operating like it's 2008, in reality, you're competing against banks operating like it's 2010, 2006, right? Like you're printing money.
Right.
Right. So it's easy to say from like us, the Agile consultant who says, well, I worked at this other company and they do all this. And, the company, there's for a lot of these companies, there's not been like a strong pressure to change their practices. Right. And interestingly, but I don't know if this will help folks because I've thought about it a lot, but at Amplitude, we break up our customers into sort of three general categories. So there's these sort of rapid scale up startups that are on their way to, an IPO, or they're big and there's a certain environment in those companies. And then you have these kind of tech companies that are 15, 20 years old plus. They're kind of trying to figure out their next act, but they're doing pretty well. And then you have these digital transformers, these large enterprises. Now, interestingly, of the three, the digital transformers they get it. They understand on a core level that there's disruption in their industry. They understand that they need to change their ways of working. They have buy-in. They have buy-in. They're the ones spending tens of millions of dollars on consultancies and different things like that. And now they have so much inertia that it's difficult. Of all three, actually, I would argue from my perspective, it's the middle ones that are the biggest pain in the butt, because hubris is their problem. They believe that they're doing things like the best in the world, and they're hardest to change just on a pure level. And the startups are just chaotic. So I don't know how we got to this particular place, but I think context really, really matters. Yeah. And we need to respect the amount of inertia that exists in these massive enterprises to move across these particular categories. It's not something that, if it took John Smart 3 years at Barclays to move to do a big transformation there, and he's one of the best in the world, and he put that in place, you can imagine it's taking other companies a decade to do this.
Cool. So I'll keep us on track. Ashley, I know that there were a few questions that we held over that were more related to more on like the defining big work, working small. I don't know if there was still that safe question or if there's any more questions. So I understand there are different scale of things and it is relative, but trying to understand what is the optimal number defined by small.
Oh, not okay. I can riff on the question, although I'm not 100% sure to understand that. But let's just get to the working small thing. If I'm in an environment where it takes even 1 to 3 weeks to get things kind of in production or get things integrated, that just feels too long. When I think about working small, and this is not just me saying, it's kind of engineering friends and other people. It's like, if you're working in the scale of a couple hours to a day or 2 or 3 to kind of go through this loop of getting something, walking away and integrating it, that's a really good indication of working small. But super important at that does not mean you're done after 3 days, right? So I think that's the thing that some of these agilists are so dogmatic about this work and that they're going to get these things done. And really, I've worked with a lot of teams. It is very hard to get anything meaningful done in 2 weeks. I'm just being honest. You can get a lot of frills done. You can get a lot of little optimizations. You can get a new feature into production, but to get something that you're confident about the outcomes it's creating, that it's thoughtful, that you've done that type of chunk of work is not in those 1 to 3 days. So hopefully that helps the person thinking about, when I'm talking about working small, I'm talking about these little cycles of integration, and I'm thinking in this sort of 1 to 3 hours and 1 to 3 days range. But that by no means means that the thing that matters is done in that period of time.
Right. Okay, cool. I think we have one more question. What do you think about SAFe?
Oh, geez.
I think we might have to have a whole other
story. There's 2 funny stories about SAFe. So I tweeted this thing that maybe Ashley can even find, where I'm I found the customer in SAFe. So it's this tweet. But So I found, I pointed this out on Twitter. And it's actually a lot of people are like, you're right. There's not even the mention of the customer in this. And what's really funny, I was at a conference and in the vendor booth area, and I could hear like the safe folks talking, and then they revised the chart to have the customer just a little bigger in the center of everything. And then I heard the person say like, well, major revision this time around is that we've put the customer at the center of everything. And I was like, score. I need to get my I poke state safe. And anyway, that's like a site. I'm going to refrain from the safe question because it's so easy to judge these large companies from the outside. And I remember, Martin Burns passed away, unfortunately, but I remember having long discussions with him, and he was very involved in the safe community. And he would really talk me through his efforts to kind of organically generate this type of model inside these companies and the degree to which SAFE actually helped sort of bootstrapped what he was doing when he did it. Yeah. And, I really like talking to Martin. And I think that I respect his perspective. So I think it's one of those things that's so easy to like I was doing is kind of make fun of this from the outside. But these enterprises are beasts to deal with. I mean, there's so much inertia in this particular environment to do it. So ideally, the question is how many of these safe environments are actually taking it beyond this kind of like dogmatic adherence to these charts and things and taking it to the next level? Because I certainly hear people bragging about how well they do safe, and that can't be the objective here. You can't stop at this kind of discombobulated set of value streams that are pulled together every quarter and expect that that's the end game for this. So I don't know. This is a complex question.
Cool. So just want to reiterate, we are super happy if everyone would just keep asking questions. If we do not get to them, we have access to the stream. We'll be able to go on there and answer your questions. And we're going to do a little write-up afterwards where we can answer some of the most common questions. So please keep asking, don't stop. So cool. So that was great. I have some experience, not myself, but seeing large organizations go through safe transformations for what is about 10 years. So I do definitely understand the complexity of extremely, extremely large organizations, and I think they're trying to do the best, and their change might be a lot slower than your startups or a different company. So yeah, I totally get it. So avoiding that question or not answering it completely is a good step. Cool. So the next thing is the last. Think big, work small. So John, you say that you consider this to be an art for product teams. So yep. Can you define it and just talk a little bit about, how you see it in the real world, what this looks like, and how product teams essentially get here and have that balance?
Yep, absolutely. So the idea here is that, so let me just talk a little bit about my motivations for putting this together and ending with that particular thing, is that the idea here is that strategy matters, right? The vision of our company matters. Like the big picture matters when we're doing these things. And so the important thing with this think big, work small thing is that we can get the benefits really of both of this type of thing. So the think big is really about, thinking strategically, thinking in terms of impact and outcomes, thinking beyond the next 6 months or the next quarter. I mean, this is the thing about OKRs or anything. As a product manager, you can do a million things that will please people in the next quarter, but will kill the company, right? There's so many perverse incentives for teams to think in terms of short-term type thinking like this. And I think what's happened is that we sort of thought that everything, we have to be agile, we have to do this particular thing. But in the process, we kind of stopped giving ourselves permission to think about the long term, thinking about sustainability, thinking about strategy, and thinking about doing those things. Now, granted, I think part of the problem there is the way many people interpret strategy is just as a plan anyway. is basically define big, work small. Many strategies are actually define big, work small instead of think big, work small. So that was kind of the motivation here, is to think about like, what does the balance mean between these particular things? And the reason why I say that it's an art is that it takes a lot of tweaking to shape these missions and sort of shape these kind of initiatives in a way that leave enough room for creativity, enough acceptance of uncertainty, enough, considerations about risk, and that engage teams in being creative and creative problem solving. That's not an easy thing. So it's really interesting when you go, when you talk to companies, they'll say, well, we use OKRs. Okay, we're doing it. It's like, it's not easy. And any CEO knows that this is the hardest thing. They want to give people these open-ended missions, but they understand you need to provide enough context. And then they know you need to create sort of enough guardrails on this to like keep risk under control and keep the team from just circling around to go nowhere. So I don't know if this is helping describe it, but I think, look, even as a when I was involved in sports or anything like that, I mean, coaches also have to deal with this a lot. They know that you can do anything in this particular game. They know that you have to play for the whole season. So not to overburden sports analogies, but I think the same thing applies. I'm not going to go there because I was about to. I really do like sports analogies, but I know that if all we talk is military and sports, it's just like you're alienating 90% of the people in the world. So,
cool.
I don't know. Yeah. Do we have questions about this one? Yeah. Maybe I'll do better with questions.
Ashley said we have two really great questions. So are there iterations over the whole process too, in case of the fourth, and separate iterations to try prototyping?
Oh, yeah. So if you notice in the picture, I made a point. I like to use words to kind of tease at things without being like too prescriptive. So in that picture, you said it's like to try, trying, and review. So if I'm understanding the question is like, back to this idea of working small, we always have to think about how we're integrating our understanding back into the world, right? And so the reason why I put to try, trying, and review is this idea, it's to do, doing, and done suggests that everything in the to-do column needs to be to do, right? It needs to be done. So the idea of to try, trying, and review here is just to remind people that really we have to consider a lot of options and experiments as we chase down this particular thing. But here's something that is important to keep in mind, that like there are big thorny architectural projects that are highly, highly valuable for a company. And they are, 12 to 18 months worth of work and a lot of people's time. And the important thing, again, is to be contextual in that thing. Are you going to be to try, trying, and whatever? Maybe not. But is it really important in a large architectural effort to like integrate your understanding and reduce risk and see if there's ways to provide incremental value and to test your assumptions? Absolutely. So you can apply that think big, work small to not just this idea of like lean startup or tiny little experiments. I mean, really it's about a direction and a mindset versus, like precise guidelines of what an iteration is or how often you're iterating.
Cool. How does product discovery play into this? Cool.
Yeah, I like questions like this. So yeah, I've seen a lot of these Agile folks sort of say things like, just start. You don't need to do any of this research up front. You don't, just get going. You'll never know anything until you put working code into the hands of the customer. Now, given my UX research background, I can say that is categorically false, right? Like there's many types of learning. I think what they're getting at is the bias to try to solve everything through research without necessarily getting something in front of them. But what we're starting to see now is the pendulum swings, so before it was like, big design up front is terrible. Why would we ever do that? We just have to get started. We've never put anything in production. And now you get the pendulum swinging to the other side where, people like Lisa at Atlassian is sort of telling me, she's like, can we just sort of like, can we let some researchers do what they really do really, really well? Like, are we really content to just iterate to nowhere? on this stuff. And so I think that back to the product discovery thing, the thing I do with the team is, what's the learning backlog? What do we need to learn here? And start with the why, not the way. So start with the why, that we need to learn these things, and then get to the way. Maybe research is the right thing for that thing, but maybe for that other thing, putting it into production tomorrow is the right thing. But too often teams are very dogmatic. Like they're either like, we must do extensive research before every effort. And on other things, we must get something into production in 2 days. And really, you're not using a contextually appropriate approach before you do that. So if you start with a learning backlog, you prioritize what you have to learn, you bring that into in progress, and then you ask, given what we know, what's the best approach for this? And it might be 3 months of UX research, and it might be 3 hours of development time to get something in production. It's just you have to start with what you need to learn. There's another one about SAFe. Interesting take on SAFe. I wonder what's been the goal of those organizations that have attempted those. I just think it's so hard to second guess. I mean, my partner works at a couple thousand person company, and so for the last 8 months during the pandemic, I've had to hear her talking, and she's had to hear me talking. And the board is putting an incredible amount of pressure on them to quote unquote. We may hate the words transformation or digital transformation, or we may think it's all played out or whatever, but you're hearing the board say, oh my God, we've run out of stuff in stock, and the digital channels are on fire, and like you have to make massive investments in the tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars range to be able to put this stuff into motion. So back to the motivations around people around SAFe, it's like, I think that unless you've sat in the shoes of someone who's having to figure out how to spend $50 million or $100 million to get this kind of outcome, that it's saying. Now, of course, you'd argue that if you work at a consultancy, you want to make $100 million, by all means, promote SAFe. So I don't know, the motivations, they're humans, and they're under intense amount of pressure, and their organizations have an immense amount of inertia behind them. So it's very hard to second guess that, I think.
Cool. So that we are going to start wrapping up. So John, the last thing I have for you is, if people are out there listening, whether they're work big, work small, whether they're a define big, work small, or they are just killing it with product. If there are 2 words, maybe 3 words that you can just leave with the audience on like how they're working or something to think about, do you have a couple words to leave people with?
Yeah, wow.
Maybe just a small image of the customer to SAFe and remember that.
To remember the customer. No, I mean, you should remember the customer. But I mean, one thing that I work a lot with teams is just building shared language in your company is a start. So often you'll meet a product team and I'll say, well, could you describe the different sort of shapes of work or the type of work you're working on? They'll say, oh, there's only 3 types. There's performance thing. They use Kano model, or there's delighters or whatever. I was like, do you treat all the work the same way? Are these strategically all important the same way? And they'll say, well, no, it's the 3 categories we use to do things. So one of the bits of advice is I've never walked into a company that had less than 15 shapes of work. There's the big thorny architectural efforts. There's the other things. There's the tiny little optimizers. So the first thing that anyone can do is just call the kettle black and build shared language, and stop oversimplifying because it comes back and bites you. If you're working in this sort of rich environment, then just call it what it is. So that would be one thing. Shared language gets you a start for anything, and then you can call things what you're talking about. I think that the other thing would kind of go back to the leading with the why, not the way, where, geez, I've had so much better success just not mentioning the word agile or digital or anything like that. It's not, these are all for the executive or whoever. The minute you just get typecast as the agile person or the OKR person or the whatever person, and that's just not where you want to be. You don't, because then it's easy to attack you. it's easy to say, well, that person's really dogmatic. All they keep talking about is Agile, or all they keep talking about are Lean, or all they keep talking about is like the DORA DevOps report, or, they just care about that. And so I think that that's one of these things where if you just remove the language, like remove all the ways that you talk about, and really try to become sort of a savvy business person in this and thinking about, what is the threat to the business? What are the opportunities here? And what am I going to do? How is what I'm going to do going to contribute to sustainable, differentiated, mid to long-term growth of the company? And like, in lieu of that, people always go to short-term goals. In lieu of outcomes, everyone will opt for the year-long roadmap. In lieu of anything tangible, progress, which is kind of the think big, work small, in lieu of that tangible progress and those outcomes, everyone will default to the most dysfunctional approaches, the next best thing, the proxy metric or whatever. So yeah, I would think that kind of like lead with the why and what you're doing here and just leave the words out of it. You'll probably be, better off, I would say.
Cool. Well, John, it has been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for joining us. I think we had a blast talking about story points in December, and super happy to have you back. And everyone, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the questions. Follow John on Twitter at John Cuttlefish, right, John? Is that right?
Yeah, that's the legacy.
Follow him on LinkedIn. You can go to Amplitude. They have some webinars coming up on March 2nd. They have a driving product-led growth through collaboration. And on March 3rd, they have a product strategy webinar. And we will be back next month with a new talk, most likely led by Susie, our head of DevOps. Also, don't forget to sign up for Summit 2021, formerly Atlassian Summit. You can go on and register today. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. That was great.
Yep, thank you. Bye, everyone.